Hello everyone and welcome to our first ever British Newspaper Archive webinar. I'm delighted today to be joined by Aoife O'Connor, who is the Data Development Manager for the British Newspaper Archive, and she'll be taking you through making the most of the BNA and how to actually get the most out of the website to use for research in the past. I'll do a quick introduction of myself. My name is Niall. I work on the content team for the British Newspaper Archive as well as Find My Past. And just to take you through as well some steps housekeeping that we're going to do today just before we get started. So the webinar has started, so if you can't hear or if you're having any sound issues, just make sure that the volume on your device is turned up all the way and that you have clicked the widget on the screen. The little red widget at the bottom of the screen represents the audio, so if you click that you should be able to hear us. If you want to download the slides that Aoife is going to go through, you can do that from the resource list. And also our full webinar, if for some reason you're having technical issues and you can't view it, the full webinar will be posted in full onto our YouTube channel, which the address is there on your screen, and also onto the blog on the British Newspaper Archive in the coming days. As well as that, within an hour or two after the actual webcast, you will be emailed an email with a link to watch it on demand. So don't worry again if you can't hear it live or if you're having any issues, you can watch this on demand. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Aoife O'Connor, who's going to start the webinar for us.
Hello everyone, and as Niall says, welcome to our first ever British Newspaper Archive webinar. We're absolutely delighted to be speaking to you all today and walking you through some of the hints and tips of getting the most out of the British Newspaper Archive and also considering historical newspapers in general. So first of all, what is the British Newspaper Archive? The British Newspaper Archive is a partnership between the British Library and the Find My Past, and we bring you newspapers from all around England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. The British Library, as a legal deposit library, is legally obliged to receive a copy of every book, pamphlet and newspaper published in the British Isles. We then take those materials and digitize them in a studio at the Boston Spa location of the British Library from microfilm and paper. We also work with individual publishers so that we can get more modern material. Newspapers have extremely strict copyright restrictions, and this means that for many materials we can only publish up as far as 1873. Where we have identified the publisher and received their permission, we can publish up to 1910. Then, with further permissions from the individual publishers, we can publish up to 1957 and beyond. We also received special permission from one publisher for some materials from World War I and World War II. And this accounts for some of what may seem like gaps in the collection, where we have publications from World War I and World War II, but inexplicably not for years before or after. This was a special project that we ran in conjunction with some of the newspapers. So what have we got? As you'll see, my slide says 756 titles. But with the way the British Newspaper Archive works, I can see that on the website today it's 757. We have titles from England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, and our coverage is from 1708 to 2003. There are over 2.6 million individual newspapers on the website, and this amounts to over 19 million pages. And again, my slide is immediately out of date after only 24 hours. We now have 19.5 billion pages on the website. The map gives you an indication of our coverage, although I am sorry to say some of the very northerly Scottish islands are cut off from that map, but we do have newspapers covering them as well. So, as you can see from this slide, the strength of our coverage is between 1800 and 1950, and in particular between 1850 and 1899, the heyday of newspapers. During the 19th century, many men with some wealth decided to set themselves up as newspaper editors and produce newspapers. Some of these newspapers only ran for a couple of years, but we are committed to bringing these newspapers to you. So, to get into a little bit more detail about what we have, there are 480 titles for England. We now have a newspaper for every county. This was achieved in recent months by adding a newspaper for Rutland, England's smallest county. And our coverage for England is 1710 to 2003. For Ireland, we have 142 titles, and we cover the entire island of Ireland. That is to say, Ireland comprises what is modern-day Northern Ireland and the South. We've not reached yet a paper for every county, but it is coming very soon. And for Ireland, we range from 1708 to 1955. For Scotland, we have 93 titles, ranging from 1739 to 1956. And for Wales, 36 titles, including 3 in the Welsh language, from 1829 to 1956. On the website, when you go into newspaper titles, you can choose to select England, Ireland, Scotland, or Wales and see the full list for yourselves for each country. So on the home page, in order to reach the list of titles, simply click on the words that say 756 titles online and you will be brought to the full list of all the titles. You can also see the latest editions by clicking on the box surrounded by the purple there on the slide, which refers to the number of pages that we have. You'll also see some drop-down menus on the home page and a map. You can click on all of these to select titles. And this is what the title list looks like. It is arranged alphabetically, and as I say, you can select England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales to narrow it down further. You can also click on the Latest tab to see what we have added in the last week or the last 30 days, or indeed, what we're going to add tomorrow. We add about 100,000 pages every week. And as I said, you can see what we've added in the last 7 days by clicking on the button, the last 30 days, or for those of you who are very eager, you can see what we're going to add tomorrow. In the main list, you will see green and red tags, and these will let you know when we last updated a title or when it arrived on site for the first time. The red new title tag drops off after 30 days. As you click on each title, you will be brought to the title page. This has a wealth of information about the newspaper that you're interested in. Not only do you get a free sample issue to look at, you can search only that title from the search box on that page. You will be told the number of issues that we currently have, the number of pages, the available years, the years we plan to add to that title, when we first added the title, and when we last updated it. Crucial for any sort of research is also seeing how that title has changed over the years. The name changes to the Birmingham Daily Mail, it simply reduced to the Birmingham Mail. Very important to know, and some titles went through some very unusual changes. One title in particular even turned into a farming title at one point, which can be rather confusing, as if for the rest of its history it covered sports and dramatic news. And we also show you what is the earliest that we have and the latest. Unfortunately, despite being a legal deposit library, the British Library does not in fact hold a copy of every newspaper ever produced, although it does have tens of millions. And so, as you can imagine, newspapers are extremely delicate, and so they don't always last. So we don't always have a full run of when the paper was published, but we do our best to get as many as possible. So I'd like to draw your attention to some of our speciality titles. As many of you know, we have ordinary newspapers for towns and counties throughout the British Isles. But we also like to bring you some speciality titles, including shipping intelligence, and you can see the list there. And remember, you will be able to get these slides afterwards, so you can take note of these. We also have some theatre and film newspapers, which are essential for researching those ancestors that trod the boards. We have sports titles, 11 of those, which are proving extremely popular, and military and navy titles, which are essential for researching your military ancestors. Two titles that I'd particularly like to draw your attention to are the Homeward Mail from India, China, and the East, and the Poor Law Union's Gazette. So let's have a look at a sample of those now. On the left, you see the Poor Law Union Gazette. This paper was produced and shipped around the country, and essentially it was small ads that described people who had run away from their parish, abandoning their family, and thus were considered runaways, and there was a £1 reward offered for their apprehension and the return to the parish on which they were chargeable. And this meant you can get some essential details about ancestors in particular. Sarah Doyle, age 22, recently imprisoned in Birmingham Borough Jail. About 5'4", brown hair dressed in a straw bonnet, silk handkerchief thrown over her dress, dark printed gown, left her child aged 10 months at 34 Court 2 House, Livery Street, now chargeable to this parish. The physical descriptions are particularly useful when trying to build a picture of your ancestor's life. And you can see how people moved around the country, or indeed how somebody may have disappeared from your family tree. On the right-hand side, we have some passenger lists from the Homeward Mail. And we receive information in the birth, marriages and death section about people who were born either in India or who had previously lived in India but were now back in the UK. This sort of detail passes back and forth across the world, even at this early date. And you can imagine that people being extremely wanting to keep people in touch with families who are abroad would create these sorts of notices in newspapers. So don't think that there isn't something for you in these newspapers if your family were residing in India. There most certainly is. So in this slide, we just have a selection of the sorts of things that you can find in newspapers. The top left-hand corner, what a boon this will be to the family that are related to this particular family here. Published in the 1890s, this is a photograph of 5 generations of one family from Scotland, giving all of their names and ages. And as I say, I'd be quite jealous of the families who discover that. In the middle, you'd be surprised the sorts of things you can find in the newspapers. This is an illustration from an early version of James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. And then again, to the right of that is Richardson's Manures. Advertisements are wonderful things in newspapers and can be quite quirky at times. And then you have, as you would expect, news of things like union strikes. The middle column, which is perhaps a little bit difficult to read, is a commentary on the Irish in Liverpool. On the left, over the map, is a theatre review, and below that is a map of Liverpool. And the far right on the bottom is an advertisement for Jane Eyre, an autobiography by Currer Bell. So the wealth and breadth of material that you can find in newspapers is quite staggering. So what's different about historical newspapers? Are there differences from modern-day newspapers? Oftentimes they were only about 4 pages long. They were produced weekly and were quite expensive. But that is not to say that your potentially illiterate family members didn't hear the news. They would be read out in cafes and bars and pinned to notice boards for other people to read out to their friends. Also, in one of the previous slides, you will have seen the newspapers available at the public library. The front page was invariably covered in notices and advertisements and did not actually have headlines or stories. There were very few images until around the 1910s, generally speaking, although the Illustrated London News had been published since the early 1800s, and there was no byline or journalists in the early newspapers, so it can be quite difficult to do journalism history, ironically, from newspapers, as journalists did not have a byline. Each story can be followed closely by the next. This can be rather confusing, as you can be jollying along, reading a story about something quite light, and find yourself reading rather a harrowing notice about a death or a murder in the next paragraph, with no break in between. And so this is a typical front page from the Birmingham Daily Mail from 1871. As you can see, it is mostly advertisements, but to the right there is some general news. News would have been drawn from all over the country, and stories will repeat from newspaper to newspaper without any changing to the wording. So what can we find in newspapers? Well, I think if we all take a deep breath, it's pretty much what you'd expect. It's what's found in newspapers today. But some of it may surprise you at how early they appeared in newspapers. Birth, marriage and death notices, for instance, begin to appear with great regularity by the 1820s. There are also rather detailed information about divorces to be found in newspapers, as to get a divorce was quite the undertaking in early periods. Advertisements, of course, but the thing to remember about 19th century advertisements in particular is that they read more like advertorials or editorials. So they read more like stories and can have an awful lot of detail about, say, your ancestors' workplace and the sort of things that they were selling. Bankruptcy and debt liability notices are published with great frequency in newspapers and are extremely detailed. They don't hold back in these 19th century newspapers. They will print full addresses of any bankrupt person. Debt liability notices are particularly detailed and somewhat amusing, insofar as they are mainly produced by husbands who are declaring that they are no longer liable for their wife's or children's debt. And so they tend to put in very detailed descriptions of their wife, where she was last known to be, and why he will not be liable for her debt. And one extremely amusing one came up recently, shared by our friends, I believe it was in Trove, where a wife actually took out a notice in the same newspaper and said that she had never been a cause for debt for her husband, and she would greatly appreciate if he would spend his money more wisely than taking out falsified ads. So you can see a lot of back and forth in the newspapers as well between people. Committee meetings, attendance and reports, and charitable donations. Newspapers printed lists and lists of people who had attended committee meetings or indeed made charitable donations. And these lists can prove that your ancestor was in a certain place at a certain time and participating in their community. You will also see property sales, and we have to consider that perhaps it was a property sale, perhaps advertising property in America, which prompted a young man to leave his family and to go off and seek a new life. Army, police and civil service promotions, exchanges and movements. Extremely detailed as well. They will let you know about promotions in the army and let you know when people move and why perhaps they move from place to place. As we all know, we have ancestors, particularly in the police and army, who tend to move about a lot with children born in many different places, and the newspapers can help you track down those exchanges and movements. Personal favourite is court cases and inquests. The level of detail in court cases from the 19th century is quite staggering. Entire verbatim transcripts will be there, and you can almost hear your ancestor's voice as they give evidence in a court. There is, of course, news, photographs, and then poetry and fiction, which can round out an appreciation of the sort of culture that your ancestor was exposed to in the 19th and 20th centuries. One thing to be aware of in newspapers is that private details are made extremely public in 19th century newspapers. They printed details that would not be allowed today. Incidents such as suicides were reported in full with details of the name of the person and the circumstances of their death. And I'll just take a moment to read out the one that I have here. Suicide in Glasgow. A man named Henry Patterson, 54 years of age, committed suicide in his own house at Rotten Row, Glasgow, on Saturday evening by hanging himself from a rope attached to a nail above the door. These sorts of details can be extremely upsetting, and I have seen cases of these types of reports right up until the 1930s, wherein somebody I was speaking to who had never spoken about their family member's suicide was confronted with it in the newspaper. So do prepare yourself for that sort of confronting and extremely detailed reporting in the newspapers. As I say, those suicide reports in that level of detail appearing right up until the 1930s. So, as I said, court cases are one of my favourite things in the newspapers, and it is rather a selfish interest I have in them, as it was a court case that broke down a brick wall for myself. My great-grandfather, Patrick Murray, born in 1861, is considered a bit of a dark horse in the family. As you may know, Irish genealogy is a little bit more challenging than anywhere else, and so we wouldn't have any censuses, so there's no possibility of me tracking Patrick through the usual types of records. But as it happened, when he was 21 years old, he was called as a witness to the Phoenix Park murders. Phoenix Park murders were some extremely famous murders that had happened in Ireland in 1882. Obviously, the trial goes into 1883, and it was the murder of the Chief Secretary and the Permanent Under-Secretary to Ireland. Of course, on the one hand, I was fascinated that he had been involved in this extremely sensational and historically important case, something that we still learn about in school today. But of course, what interested me as a genealogist was that it gave me some details about his life that I had been unable to find in other records. I knew from his marriage certificate that he had worked at Farmley, but here it was, a labourer at Farmley, and he was going to his father's house to sleep at Carpenterstown between Castleknock and the Strawberry Beds. And so at this age of 21, some years before his marriage, I was able to pinpoint a location and the fact that his father had lived in Carpenterstown. Carpenterstown is an extremely small area, and so I was able to pinpoint the family with great accuracy. Notice how the two articles I have here, and it is reported in several articles, although these events happened in Ireland, the newspaper articles are from Wales and Manchester. And not only that, but they differ from each other greatly insofar as the level of detail they give and the differing level of detail they give. And both are printed on Saturday the 17th of February, 1883. So the same day, but distinctive information being given in both. And in one, we hear something of his voice and the fact that I warrant he was heading off to the pub when he passed through the Phoenix Park and witnessed the events that he witnessed. So on that note, context of your ancestor's life is on a local scale. Notwithstanding the fact that my ancestor had brushed up against an extremely famous event in Irish history, most of your ancestor's life is going to be at a very local scale. And newspapers can give you insight into the small events that occurred in your local area, which would have affected your ancestor to a far greater extent in most cases than national events like the First World War or any of the revolutions or anything that we read about in the history books. The newspaper's great quality is that you can dig into that very local detail and see the sort of push and pull factors that might have been at work in your ancestor's life. Perhaps it wasn't a case of some traumatic situation to do with a national event that resulted in their change of career or their descent into poverty. Perhaps it was the fact that a local factory closed down, or indeed that a landlord cleared off some land. So do look to the newspapers to fill in those details of your ancestor's life between the censuses. As you've seen as well from my example, you must never restrict yourself to your local paper. Newspapers printed stories from all over the country, and it is not at all unusual to find a story from a village anywhere in the world, I say Ireland, published in a local paper in Scotland. Again, if I can turn to my own example, the very first mention of my hometown in Dublin is in fact in a newspaper in Scotland in 1739. The story itself is a murder, and it is of a local baron murdering a young man who worked in a tavern in the town. Spoiler alert, the young baron got away with the murder. He had initially been sentenced to be hung, but in fact that was acquitted from that and eventually pardoned entirely, although I believe he did move away. So as I say, never restrict yourself to that local newspaper. I can appreciate that at first glance it might be slightly overwhelming to see quite so many mentions of your hometown across all of the newspapers, and by all means restrict yourself to a certain period of years or indeed local newspapers to begin with, but do keep coming back to all of the newspapers and see what's being reported further afield. So let's get down to some search strategies. The first thing we have to remember is that first names sometimes appear in newspapers, but oftentimes don't. So you want to be searching for your ancestor as Mr. Smith, or a young lady called Smith, or indeed, if it is a married woman, Mrs. Smith or Mrs. John Smith. And apologies to all the ladies out there for 19th century sensibilities about women. Delayed news. In a time before the telephone, news could be delayed for several weeks. Please search for at least a month after the event for more detailed accounts. As you can imagine, stories often grow, more detail comes out. Or indeed, might not have reached the newspaper for a couple of weeks after it happened. Historical language. It's so important to understand how our ancestors thought about things and how people in the past thought about things. As you know, World War I was simply the Great War, or just the war itself. In Ireland, World War II was known as the Emergency. Just recently, of course, Her Majesty the Queen turned 91, but when she was a baby, she was the Duchess of York's baby girl. She wasn't Princess Elizabeth, and she was certainly not the future Queen at that time. So do keep in mind the historical context of what you're looking at. Newspapers and how we search them. So we know that newspapers are not indexed in the same way as historical records. Nobody sits and types up every word that's in a newspaper. Instead, we use something called optical character recognition. And in essence, the computer takes a picture of what it sees and attempts to turn that into text. Now, as you can appreciate with newspapers, particularly where they are very faded, some of the parts of the letters can appear to be missing as far as the computer is concerned. And if we look at the example that we have on the screen, if you just look at the bottom line, foreign and domestic news, you all know that F shape that is in fact an S in the 18th century, and I'm afraid that does rather confuse the computer. Also, OCR is improving all of the time, but much of our OCR on the British Newspaper Archive was carried out between 2011 and 2015. And although we're looking to improve it all the time, you have to understand that some of the newspapers are that little bit older in terms of when they were OCR'd. So please keep in mind that there are some strategies that you'll need to use when searching OCR text. We'll want to use a combination of search terms and to use all of the search features that have on our site to make your search as accurate as possible. So let's look at a typical search. When I type Taylor Carter into the basic search, these are the two results that I get. As you can see, for your convenience, the words Carter and Taylor are highlighted in green so that you can pick them out and see if the context matches what you're looking for. Also take a moment to note the date and the newspaper that the information is coming from, especially, as I said, in those early searches where maybe you do want to just narrow your focus ever so slightly to a local newspaper before you work a little bit broader if you're not coming up with the search results that you expect. Obviously, the date is going to be extremely important because if something, as you can see here, we have a report from 1881 and a report from 1916, so these are very far apart and only one of them is going to be relevant for our search. So we look at the singular death of a Carter, and when you actually open the article, you will see that your words, instead of being now highlighted in green, have little blue boxes around them. And the article that you were looking at is a lighter colour than the articles which surround it. At this point, you might want to make a note of the exact date of the newspaper article if it is of interest to you, and the page number on which it appears for your source citations. Now, you can move on and see where this article fits in the newspaper in total. And to do that, you will click on the little icon that looks like a screen that I've highlighted with the red circle on the slide. And this will bring the article up in the context of the page. And as you can see, it's more obvious now that the article that you're looking at is in a lighter colour and the rest has been sort of shaded out. If you want to get a further idea of where this fits in on the page, you can choose to wipe out the highlighting on this by selecting the refresh button, which I've highlighted here on the screen. And this will zoom you out, and this red arrow will not be on your screen. I'm just pointing out where that article sits on the page. But this is the full page of the article. Now, these are newspapers, of course, and so they are rather large in format, A3 or bigger. And if you were to print off that page onto an A4 piece of paper, essentially that's what you get. Huge blocks of text printed onto a tiny space, and therefore really not much use for you. So what you want to do is you want to use our zoom in buttons, and on PCs you should have something called the Snipping Tool. When you've zoomed into a level where you can read it, you can use the Snipping Tool to capture, sort of cut out just that piece so that you can read it properly. On a Mac, you have to press Command, Shift and 4 together, and then you get the little scissors function by which you can snip out just your article. But in order to remove those little blue boxes, you do need to do that previous function of the refresh, and you just need to kind of remember where it is on the page and then zoom back into it so that you get a nice clean image for sharing on Twitter or Facebook or putting into your research documents. So, advanced search. Advanced search actually is almost like a simple search on the British Newspaper Archive, insofar as the British Newspaper Archive supports you being able to use quotation marks so that you get an exact phrase. You can also use minuses to remove a word. But if you're not comfortable with things like pluses and minuses and quote marks, do use the advanced search to achieve the same ends. So pop into advanced search and type in any words that you want to leave out, or where you want something to appear as a phrase, so the words are absolutely next to each other. And that way you'll get the most pinpointed results for what you're looking for. Each of our advanced search options have a little eye beside them, a little information nodule, and if you hover over that, it will give you more detail on what using that section of advanced search will do for your search. So for instance, exact search. So our standard search includes variants of your keywords. If you search for fish, you will also get results for fishes, fished, and fishing. But if you only want fish and not fishing, fishes, and fished, you would click exact search, and that would narrow down your results still further. Also in advanced search, you can search on the dates of when newspapers were published. And I find this particularly useful to search for articles which were published during the periods of World War I and World War II. And this allows you to take a focused period of history and only search for a theme or a subject and how it was being discussed at that time in history. Obviously, one of the great joys of digitizing newspapers is that you no longer need to know when something happened. But by the same token, if you're looking at a very strong subject or a very strong theme, you do maybe want to sometimes narrow that search down to papers that were only published in a particular period. That said, we had a recent situation where we had some people who were absolutely convinced that a court case had begun in the 1890s, and I persuaded them perhaps maybe we want to just leave the search a little bit open for the time being, and lo and behold, the court case had in fact started in the very, very late 1880s. So do keep an open mind where dates are concerned. Use them to your advantage or leave them out where you're not sure when an event happened. So we offer a number of search filters on the British Newspaper Archive. If you're doing regular searches with us, you might want to reduce your searches to just new newspapers that we've added. So you can just look at articles we've added today or in the last 30 days if it's something that you are looking to track regularly in newspapers, particularly if you're doing historical rather than genealogical research. You can also narrow by date ranges, and also this will allow you to see patterns, particularly for historical events or historical terms. We had a wonderful story recently where a gentleman was able to push back the use of the word bypass in connection with roads by 11 years by seeing that the term had in fact come up in an earlier period. You can, of course, filter by newspaper, and then we also offer the ability to filter by types of articles, including illustrated and family notices. We also encourage you to put your own tags onto records and newspaper articles to help your fellow researchers. Now, a note on our place filters on the British Newspaper Archives. These are specific to where the newspaper was published and are not internal to where the news was being reported from. This is an important point to keep in mind. So as I say, I don't always encourage narrowing by place, but as I say, sometimes it can be useful. However, you are searching by where the newspaper was published, not by where the event took place. So when you search by London, England, you will still get news from all over the country. Now, one of our favorite features that we offer on the BNA is the ability to save your research. And you can save it into a number of folders. And so you can create a folder for every topic that you're interested in. So find the article that you're interested in, use the little flag that's grayed out in the top right-hand corner with the little plus symbol in it, click on it and it turns red. And you can just as easily cancel this action, either by pressing cancel as you're going along, or indeed clicking on the little red flag and it will turn back to being grey with a plus on it. And you can just switch off the fact that you have saved it. And then you can save it into a research folder. And I have one for genealogy and family history and one for my local hometown. And you can sort your research to your heart's content. It even tells you when you saved it. So we like to offer a few ways into our newspapers, and 5 of our newspapers are extremely heavily illustrated, and for those we can offer a picture search. So a little bit like Google, you can type in a word, and instead of being returned articles, you will be returned pictures. You can then choose to view the article that picture came from. So that's an extremely special thing for 5 of our newspapers on the archive, and we hope you enjoy using that. So obviously we have our blog where all of our hints and tips are, and we also have a help and advice section on the website, and do make the most of those. And of course, we would love you to keep in touch with us, and you can do that on Facebook, you can do that on Twitter, and we also send out a regular newsletter, and of course the blog. And if you are sharing your stories on Facebook or Twitter, please do use that snipping tool on your computer or take a screenshot and share that along with your tweet or your Facebook. We'd love to see your finds. So I think that's about all from me. I'll hand back over to Niall, and he can let you know how we've been getting on today.
Thank you very much, Aoife. That was really, really useful from my point of view. I hope everyone out there watching finds it useful as well. Basically, what we're going to do now is a lot of questions have been submitted to the team, and the team are working away to try and get through them all. There is a huge volume, so if your question hasn't been answered yet, please do bear with us. We'll try to get through as many as possible. I've lined up a few questions for Aoife, and I will run through them with her now as well live. But also, I've got a little poll here on your screen. So if you'd like to take this poll and just let us know, because we love to hear your feedback if you actually found this webinar useful. And I will now jump into our live Q&A, but also just to say on your screen there in front of you is a 20% off discount offer that we have running at the moment exclusively for viewers of this webinar. So on the British Newspaper Archive, if you're not already subscribed, you can use that code BNAWeb20 and you'll get 20% off either of our subscription packages. So that's from a 1-month subscription or a 12-month subscription. That'll give you 20% off. Just to jump into the Q&A now for Aoife to start asking her some questions. The first question we've got in, Aoife, is from Robert Hogan, and Robert wants to know, are workhouses in the newspapers?
Absolutely, Robert. The Poor Law Union's Gazette is produced by the Poor Law Union, which of course ran the workhouses. You'll also find a lot of information about conditions in workhouses and anything that is coming out, be it scandals or positive, from the workhouses throughout the UK and Ireland in the newspapers.
That's great. Thanks, Aoife. Another question in here from Jeff Hobbs. Thank you, Jeff. And Jeff has asked us, is it possible to get a good copy from the original of a photograph?
Generally speaking, high-resolution images are only available to those who are looking to reproduce them to publish in books. We do have a cost associated with them, and you will find that information on the website in our Rights and Reproduction section in the Terms and Conditions. But generally speaking, I think you'll find that the image that you can download from the website yourself as PDF, and then you could save it as a JPEG, is more than sufficient for your own personal research, or indeed for using in a presentation for a school or college, or if you're doing something with your local history society. I just want to emphasize that if you're doing something for your local history society, or if it's just for your own private research, there's absolutely no cost involved whatsoever. It's only if you're publishing something commercially that there is a cost associated with getting an extremely high resolution image from the team at the BNA.
Great, thanks, Aoife. I've seen a couple of comments come in just saying that the poll went really quickly from the screen. I got ahead of myself, obviously, so I've just put the poll back up on the screen. So if you want to vote on that poll, you can do so now. And I'll continue on with the questions for Aoife. So I've got a question in, Aoife, from Kim Barnsdale. And Kim is asking, in searching these papers, can we search my name of an ancestor, or do I just have to read the papers for certain time frames?
Absolutely would encourage you to search for your ancestor's name. As I said earlier in the webinar, you may find that your ancestor's full name is not reproduced in the paper. If they were involved in an accident or anything like that, in fact, they may just be referred to by a lady from whatever their address was, or as I said, Mr. Smith or Mrs. John Smith. They go by their husband's name a lot of the time, the ladies. So if you're looking for a person, use those quote marks and use perhaps something like their occupation. Try out a few search terms. So you're going to want to search on your ancestor's name, but also on maybe their hometown along with their name, or as I said, their occupation. But absolutely don't be limiting yourself to time frames other than perhaps the time frame within which your ancestor was alive, because obviously they're unlikely to appear after their death, except for perhaps a couple of months afterwards if there is a death notice or an obituary.
Lovely, thanks Aoife. I'm just going to flick back onto the offer screen now, so hopefully you've all voted in the poll, and the offer code is back on the screen now if you want to note it down to be able to take advantage of that discount. A question in from Joe Evans here, Aoife, and it's actually a question I've seen a few times here today. Can you elaborate on the difference between the BNA and the FMP newspaper searches?
Absolutely. The British Newspaper Archive, as you know, is a newspaper-only search. So we only have newspapers on the British Newspaper Archive. The search on Find My Past is very much geared towards indexed records, that is to say records which have been typed up. I would consider the newspapers on Find My Past an invaluable resource for family historians, and frankly, if you have a subscription to Find My Past, you may find that it is more than sufficient for your needs. If, however, you're interested in newspapers specifically, you will find the search on the British Newspaper Archive more sophisticated for your needs. There are a certain number of filters on Find My Past, but the ones on the British Newspaper Archive site are specifically geared and generated towards newspapers, and thus will serve you better if newspapers is your main interest.
Thanks, Aoife. And Michael Bailey has submitted a question. Why does the search engine occasionally miss the exact words one is looking for? It sometimes seems unreliable.
I can appreciate that can seem to be the case. It is down mostly to the OCR. Newspapers, if you can imagine an old newspaper yourself, oftentimes the conditions they were kept in were not ideal. And the newspaper print itself can bleed or can come through from the other side, and thus confusing the OCR engine, the optical character recognition, which, as I said, is the computer essentially taking a photograph of what it sees and trying to turn that into a piece of text. So if something like an F has a missing squiggle at the end, it's going to think that perhaps it's the letter I, or indeed an E with a missing piece at the end is going to look like an F. So all I can suggest is that you use all of the other tips and tricks that we discussed today, and that perhaps you think of other search terms that are aligned to what you're looking for.
Lovely, thank you. I've seen a couple of questions come in about the offer code as well, just regarding how long it's going to be valid for. The answer is the end of this month, so the 31st of May, that code will expire. Another question for you here, Aoife. Is there a way to find out, sorry, this came in from Jonathan Vernon, and Jonathan wants to know, is there a way to find out who the journalists were, if not for a particular piece, but who were working on the paper at that time?
That is a very good question. It's not something that I'm a particular expert in. Until bylines come in, there is some works out there with regard to journalism that can allow you to know. But generally speaking, journalists at the time were piece writers. They were paid by the line, and they would submit their work to several different newspapers. As I say, that is something that we can certainly look into for you, and we can pick it up in another webinar perhaps to talk about journalism in the 19th century.
Great, thanks, Aoife. An interesting one in here from Diane Freeman. Thanks, Diane. I'm a mystery writer, and my current work involves the murder of a gossip columnist in 1899. I'm looking for some examples of gossip reported at that time. Is there an easy way to find out which papers carried that type of news?
Okay, that is a wonderful question. Generally speaking, it tends to be things like the Illustrated London News, the Tatler, although I'm not sure that was going in 1899. The sort of more tabloidy newspapers would certainly have that type of thing. just blanking on the name of an Irish newspaper for you, which is a society newspaper. So anything with the word society in it, and in fact columns with the word society in them, because that tends to be where the gossip columns were. So in particular at court. So if you look for royal, anything to do with the royal court or fashion, the word fashion tends to appear a lot where gossip columns were concerned.
Lovely. I do always try to catch you out with some interesting questions, Aoife. Robert Hyatt has sent one here as well. This is a little bit more straightforward for you, I'd imagine, because you've already covered some of it in the slides. But could you give us a rundown again on the best way to search the newspapers on the British Newspaper Archive, some tips?
Okay, it's a kind of a how long is a piece of string question, but we can certainly try. Insofar as it very much depends on your topic. So as I say, in the first instance, go to your history books, go to Google, look at all of the background that you can get to your topic, if it's not to do with a person, this is. Or even if it is to do with a person, look at what was happening in their local area and go back to the newspapers and start to delve into the stories of that particular event or that particular area. And so to do that, you will be looking at using a selection of search terms. No harm in keeping a notebook beside you, writing out a list of your search terms and ticking each one off as you go. When you get your results in themselves can give you a lot of information. You want to be looking at when the search term starts to come into use, and then when it starts to be really, really popular, and then maybe when it starts to fall away. And just take some notes about how you're going to approach your research. As I say, invaluable to have a notebook and to use those folders in saved research that we have so that you can start to organize your research. But it really is about getting into the mindset of the 18th and 19th century and thinking about how they thought about things. So things are always sensational or tragic. The much sort of overblown language in the 19th century. And then, as I say, just work down methodically through either chronologically, or narrow yourself to a chronology if it is about a particular person's life. And then, as I say, in that first instance, you might want to narrow yourself down to some local newspapers, but by the same token, as you get more sophisticated in your research, you're going to want to be broadening out across the whole country to see where else those stories might be mentioned. And then finally, once you're sort of into your research, you're going to only want to be looking at the most recently added articles that we've put up on the site so that you're getting that fresh material only.
Thank you very much, Aoife. As the Q&A continues, I'm actually going to put up another question onto the screen now. And this one is basically, because this is our first British Newspaper Archive webinar, we want to know what topics you'd like to see covered, or if we do future ones, and hopefully we will do more. So if you want to add your comments in there and submit them, we'll take a look at the list afterwards, and we'll be able to look at the most popular topics that people want and possibly have that as the next webinar subject. Getting back to the Q&A now. Fred Flack has submitted a question. Thanks, Fred. And he's asking, is there an index list of newspapers you hold by county?
Hi, Fred. Although there isn't a list in the same way as that there is the country list for Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales, what you can do from the home page is you'll see a yellow bar that says choose a county. When you choose a county and then it pops over into the search, you can then filter by newspaper in the same way. So just click on More Newspapers on the left-hand side, and you will get a list of newspaper. Generally speaking, this will only be 1 to 2 pages long, and you can either use your mouse to select, just drag over it and select it like a list, and copy the list and then paste it into Word or something like that. Or you may just find it useful just to scan down through the list yourself to get a sense of the newspapers from that county. I should emphasize, of course, that this is where the newspaper was published, and therefore there will be stories in that newspaper from all around the country.
Thanks, Aoife. Ian Russell has submitted a question basically asking if and when we're hoping to introduce a snipping tool onto the British Newspaper Archive.
Although I know of no immediate plans, it's certainly something I will bring back to our development team because it is an extremely interesting suggestion.
Lovely. Fiona Barry is asking, do the newspapers include obituaries? And if yes, can they be easily searched by using that person's name and maybe their hometown? So specifically, I suppose, a question for genealogists and family historians who'd be interested in obituaries.
Absolutely. Not only would using the person's name in quote marks assist, and perhaps the town name, or indeed newspapers from that immediate area, don't forget to use down on the left-hand side of our Filter Your Search feature, once you go into the search, that you can filter your search by family notices. And this is where we have used the OCR and search engine to identify where we're seeing births, marriages, and deaths in newspapers. Full obituaries would tend to be a lot more detailed, and therefore it will often feature not only the person's name but also another family's person's name. So you can actually use both in the search box. You can put the first person's name in quotes, Joe Blogs, and then you can use the word and or a plus symbol, and use then in quote marks again another person's name. And then, of course, because it is an obituary, you would expect it to appear in the newspapers in the sort of 6-week to 2-month period around the person's death or on the anniversary of their death. So use those two pieces to look for that obituary. So you'll want to use a date range, narrow down a date range from our advanced search, sort of about 2 months after the death has taken place.
Lovely. I'm seeing a lot of people submitting topics that they'd like to see covered via the Q&A screen. If you can actually add it onto the slide and submit it there, that's how we'll actually be able to pick it up, because we'll get that list afterwards and we'll be able to look through it. So back to Aoife's questions. David Fry has submitted a question. Thank you, David. Why do you need permission from publishers for papers after 1873, as many will be out of copyright?
Absolutely. So what we do is we're extremely cautious about what we publish, as newspapers, as I said, have extremely long copyright. The main copyright on newspaper is 144 years. It then drops to 107 years, wherein as long as the publisher does not object, we can publish up to 1910. On a rolling basis, next year it will be 1911. So what we do in situations where we are confident that the newspaper no longer is in business and there is no business which has inherited the rights to that newspaper, we publish the newspaper up as far as 1910 and in some cases up as far as 1956. And we have a disclaimer on the site that we appreciate that if there is in fact somebody who owns the rights to that newspaper, we will either take down the newspaper or negotiate with them for further permissions with regard to that newspaper. So we are running an exercise where we look at each newspaper, and if we cannot find any contemporary owner of that material, we will publish it up as far as we can get it.
That's great. Thanks, Aoife. Caroline Cunningham, thank you for your question, Caroline. Caroline's asking, can you search for pictures on the website?
Absolutely, you can search for pictures. You can do this in 2 ways. Obviously, many of our regular newspapers have pictures, and on down again on that left-hand side of our search feature, you can choose to search only pages which have been noted as having illustrations on them, or are noted as being what we call graphic. You can then use our in-pictures search, which can be found by going brishnewspaperarchive.co.uk/pictures, and this is restricted to 5 highly illustrated titles from the Illustrated London News Group. So that is an extremely visual search, but any of our newspapers which are illustrated or have pictures in them can also be narrowed down, as I say, on that left-hand side with our other picture filters, which, as I say, are illustrated or graphic checkboxes.
Thank you. And we're coming up to the end of the webinar, but we do have time to fit in a few more questions, so I'll get as many in as possible. Fran Bell is asking, if searching family notices, is it necessary to search for Smith John as well as John Smith?
No, I don't believe it is. The OCR should understand that the words simply need to be near one another. So John Smith and Smith John, although in some cases it might return slightly different search results, generally speaking, it will return them for both instances.
Great, thanks Aoife. Just to say again, guys, if you'd like to see a topic covered in future British Newspaper Archives, please add it onto the poll on this slide at the moment, and we will be able to see that list afterwards and be able to go through it and see what the most popular topics were. So time for a couple more questions to be able to squeeze in. I have one here from Victor Badin, and Victor's asking, can you explain the absence of newspapers from 1950 to the present day? Thank you.
Hello, Victor. Yes, newspapers from 1950 to the present day. With those newspapers, and most of those newspapers are still being published today. On the one hand, some of those newspapers have their own archival sites, and so are not open to discussion with the British Newspaper Archive. And in other cases, we are in active negotiations with newspapers to permit us to publish their archives to the British Newspaper Archive. Generally speaking, though that material is still considered modern by those newspapers and is not necessarily going to be available on our archive, but we are, as I say, in constant negotiations.
Thank you, Aoife. Now, one more question possibly. How can we ask for a local newspaper to be included in future digitisation? And that comes in from James Beechel.
Hello, James. Thank you for your question. We have a section on the website where you can make these very suggestions. So if you go to the help section on our site, and we have a section there called Newspapers We Should Add Next. As I discussed early on, we scan the newspapers mostly from the holdings of the British Library. So in the first instance, the British Library would need to hold a copy. It would also need to be out of copyright, or the publisher, if it's still in copyright, would need to give us permission to scan it. Depending on how it is held, if it's held on microfilm, that is something that we can scan at rather large volumes. If it's on paper, that takes a lot longer to scan. As you can imagine, paper is extremely physical and it's large and takes an awful lot more handling than microfilm. And so please do make your suggestion in Newspapers We Should Add Next in our help and advice section.
Great, Aoife's absolutely flying through these questions, so we do have time to squeeze in a few more. Barbara Brennan is asking, have you any tips for searching for a very common name?
I think, Barbara, in your instance, I would actually suggest maybe narrowing down to that geographic area to begin with, and a little bit more of a narrow date range for an extremely common name. Also, as I said, take a deep breath, think about the family, think about occupations that they had, streets that they may have lived on, towns that they may have lived in. As I say, 19th century newspapers are extremely detailed and they're not afraid to publish somebody's exact house address. It's no harm to give it a whirl, to put it in that exact street address and see what comes up. Also look around the topic. If you know anything about where they were working, or if you know anything about other family members, perhaps not the exact direct line that you're looking at, but use the same principles that you're using for your genealogy. FAN, friends, associates, neighbours. And just sort of try and go around the issue, but as I say, in your instance, just to get you started, I would say narrow down to those very local newspapers, or at least the county newspaper, and narrow down your date range to when you know that person would have either been active or alive in that area. So obviously by active, I mean, generally speaking, you won't see children's names very much in newspapers. So you want somebody into young adulthood and into later life when you're searching for them.
Thank you, Aoife. Just checking to see any other questions here. There's a question here I can actually answer myself. Are you able to access the homepage of the BNA at Find My Past? And that's in from Winifred Evans. Winifred, no is the answer. Find My Past and the British Newspaper Archive, although we are all under one umbrella company, we are two separate websites. So the British Newspaper Archive you can only access at britishNewspaperarchive.co.uk, and Find My Past you can access obviously at findmypast.com.co.uk, .ie or .com.au. They are two separate websites, although the newspapers, the actual holdings of the newspapers are the same on both websites. I'm just popping up on the screen again, guys, the offer code and slides, because I see some people asking about it again. So the code, just as a reminder, is BNAWeb20. That will give you 20% discount off either the 12-month subscription or a 1-month subscription on the British Newspaper Archive. Just jumping back into the Q&A now. We've got a couple of minutes left to see if there are any more that we can squeeze in. Okay, this is quite a specific one here, Aoife. It's come in from Richard Huxley. And Richard is saying, Sometimes when carrying out a search, the blue box does not correspond to the position of the text used in the search. Is there anything you can do to identify where the text is?
Yes, that can be a problem with some of the material that was OCR'd and what we call zoned early on. So all I can do is suggest that you look for keywords around the word in the hopes of narrowing it down, but that's something that we're going to have to review with our development team.
Lovely. Thank you, Aoife. And that's pretty much it for today, guys. Overall, I think a lot of the feedback for our first webinar has been massively positive, so thank you all for that. And we will take a look at the topics that you've submitted, but that's it for now. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Bye-bye.